we just waste like tons and tons of cycle without actually knowing like, okay, of these like 25 proposals, which one do we actually want to spend a bunch of time reviewing? Which one do we want to implement and prototype? And then which ones do we want to ship on mainnet? We would try to do all of that at the same time, and it was very hard to coordinate. This is the right process in a way, because when we deploy an EIP on mainnet, we can't ever take it out, right? Like the blockchain has to keep it forever. So we have to be extremely, extremely sure about it. It's not trivial to remove EIPs from hard forks, and it's also prone to bugs. We've had bugs on the Ethereum mainnet because we've done a poor job of removing EIPs in the past.
And welcome back to PEEPanEIP, where we dive into Ethereum improvement proposals and protocol development. This is episode 149, brought to you by ECH Institute. I'm your host Pooja Ranjan, and today we are going to discuss one-of-a-kind proposal, EIP-7723, Network Upgrade Inclusion Stages. EIP-7723 was documented in June 2024. This is a Meta EIP that is currently in last call status, and the proposal has been partially tested with Spectra upgrade. It's close to being made as a standard. Since this is a new way of doing things, some of the community members may still have some questions about how it works, what it means for Ethereum upgrade process. To help explain it clearly, we are joined by Tim Beiko, who helps Ethereum's all core dev calls. And he is also the author of EIP 7723. Tim, welcome again to PEEPanEIP.
Thanks for having me.
We are super excited to have you here and so thankful for your time. I understand you have been coming on PEEPanEIP time to time to talk about different proposals and share the latest upgrades. So I understand there are a lot of activities ongoing over past few months. We have seen a lot of effort going into improving Ethereum's governance and a lot of development of processes around that. EIP 7723 is one example. And there have also been some discussion happening on Fellowship of Ethereum Magician around all core dev process improvements. So in today's conversation, we would love to better understand the network upgrade inclusion stages. And if time permits, we'll also explore few of other ongoing process improvement efforts such as ACDE process. So for all who are new here, Tim, if you could kindly share a little bit about yourself, how you got involved with Ethereum, your journey so far, and what is that you are most excited about for 2025 and 2026?
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me again. Big question to start with. So what I do today is run the all core devs calls for Ethereum. I also work at the Ethereum Foundation and help with a lot of things around client development grants and different programs to support core devs, whether this is like the protocol fellowship or organizing interop events. So I do a lot of just core dev related work. I got into Ethereum actually working on one of the core clients. So I used to be a product manager working in tech, and I loved Ethereum, but I didn't want to work on any of the specific applications at the time. This was in 2016, 2017. I felt like they were all quite speculative and a bit too risky for me to join. So I wanted to work on improving the protocol, but there was no kind of product manager of the protocol. That role didn't exist. So I spent probably like a year or so just trying to think of different roles and learning Solidity and applying to a bunch of places and getting rejected. And eventually I got lucky that Consensus put together a new client team, which is now the Beiko team. And they kind of structured it like a normal tech startup with product managers and engineers. So I got a full-time job there working as the product manager on the Beiko client on the mainnet implementation. When I joined the Beiko team, they had just finished implementing the kind of first version of the client. So it worked as an archive node, but it was extremely slow. It was not performant. So even though it passed all the tests and it conformed to the spec, it wasn't something that you could actually use in production quite well. And so I spent 2-3 years there effectively working on a bunch of performance features, and at the same time as that, continuing to support the different hard forks and EIPs. So through that, I got quite involved with the all core devs process. At the time, there weren't many people attending the All Core Devs call that weren't just core dev engineers. So I was one of the few kind of product managers or more like process-minded people there. I spent a lot of time just helping Hudson, who was running these calls since pretty much Ethereum's launch, around a bunch of Ethereum project management stuff. And then in 2020, Hudson decided to step away. So he'd been running the calls for over 5 years. And I decided to take over from him and focus on that. So that's what I do now.
You had been modest enough to not mention that you are actually kind of running the entire ecosystem right now, because everybody who is trying to follow Ethereum protocol must be following all core dev calls, and herding core developers is challenging. Thank you for battling that very well for us. Well, I understand for today's proposal, you have been trying to document the process here, the process that you think could be useful for managing network upgrades, which is one of the core activities around process management for Ethereum. So I'll be curious to hear your thought. What motivated you to formalize this as an EIP, the network process, into a proposal?
Yeah, so there's always been this weird tension between EIPs and hard forks, where EIPs are meant to be these standalone documents that can be used in any context, but at the end of the day, they are very coupled to like the core Ethereum network, right? So even though other blockchains might use EIPs, and obviously there's test nets and those change, most people, when they think of the EIP process, what they care about is like, this EIP is going on Ethereum mainnet. And so, how should this be like included or proposed or whatnot? And historically, we only had like a very like casual way to signal that. So we have kind of these formal stages to the EIPs themselves, like a draft, review, last call, whatever. And these correspond to the level of finalization of the spec. So is this proposal actually final or not? But it's kind of independent from whether it's adopted on the Ethereum mainnet. You can have a proposal that's final but never gets adopted, and it just means you have a spec that's complete. And similarly, a lot of the most important changes we've made to Ethereum, and including the ones we're doing now, like take PeerDAS as an example, there's still a lot of heavy iteration on the actual spec and EIPs as we work on this, even though we agree that this is the thing we want to put in the next hard fork. And so historically, what we would do when like I started participating in All Core Devs is we would have like this one stage like included. So we would look at all the possible EIPs that we could include, and then we would decide which ones to include, and that would be it, and we would implement them. And the problem with this is we would just spend so much time kind of debating and deciding and trying to get to the final step that we just waste like tons and tons of cycle without actually knowing like, okay, of these like 25 proposals, which one do we actually want to spend a bunch of time reviewing? Which one do we want to implement and prototype? And then which ones do we want to ship on mainnet? We would try to do all of that at the same time, and it was very hard to coordinate. And one reason why this is hard to coordinate is there's many different client teams, right? So if you did all of this with one team, it would already be hard. Imagine there's 30 proposals. You need to figure out the 10 you want to spend time on and the 5 that you actually want to ship. If one client team is doing this, it's already quite hard. But if you have 10 different client teams doing it at the same time, then it means that when you go from 30 to 10 in that first like triage stage, maybe not everybody agrees and people are like reviewing different things. And then when you're asking about EIP A, not everybody's reviewed it because some people were looking at EIP B. And then similarly, when you get to implementing and you want to test these features in the clients, then maybe client 1 has implemented EIPs A and B, and client 2 has B and C, and client 3 has C and D. And so it's really hard to get everyone moving together in the same direction. And the last part of context here is nothing is ever final or like fully included on Ethereum until it ships on mainnet. Like we have many cases in Ethereum's history of just finding an issue with a feature and removing it, right before shipping it on mainnet. And this is the right process in a way, because when we deploy an EIP on mainnet, we can't ever take it out, right? Like the blockchain has to keep it forever. So we have to be extremely, extremely sure about it. But before, the only stage we had was called included. And so that kind of implied like, oh, this thing is going to go to mainnet, even though in practice, a lot of them didn't. We also didn't have a good way before to say no to EIPs. And this has been a problem in the past on All Core Devs, where if the person who's pushing the EIP has a lot of incentives to be very vocal and very like pushy for it every time. And the core devs, they kind of just want to say no once and not think about it. Or even if we know that something is a priority, even just reviewing something can be hard. And like people have like this expectation that core devs should like review every single EIP. But if we just do this blindly, then it means a way you can stop the entire process is just submit a bunch of EIPs for core devs to review and kind of argue with them. So to kind of address with all of this, the idea with 7723 is that we should have some stages that just correspond to what part of the hard fork planning schedule an EIP is in. And this is independent from the status of the EIP, like whether it's a draft or in review, but it's more about how close is it to be on mainnet. So happy to go into the details of the different status, but I can stop there if there's any questions or clarifications before.
Well, the why part has been very well explained. We will get into status versus stages and would like to explore more about how it happens. So if you can maybe walk us through different EIP stages and maybe provide an overview, and if there is any specific minimum criteria to be considered into that particular stages.
Right, yeah. Okay, so I'll start with the stages at a high level and then we can go into more depth. But so the idea of these hard fork stages is that we want to, again, map this process between someone has an idea for an EIP on Ethereum to something has been shipped on mainnet. So the first stage of the process is called proposed for inclusion. And this is also something that we used to do very poorly. Before, we didn't have a formal way to track which EIPs are actually proposed by the community. It's been done in kind of ad hoc ways where people would post it on the all core devs agenda. Sometimes we would use ETH magicians. Sometimes it was like a GitHub issue. So the first step was saying like, if you want to propose an EIP for a hard fork, there should be a clear place. And this is the proposed for inclusion status. So every hard fork today has a meta EIP associated with it that tracks all the EIPs. And for the proposed for inclusion status, anyone can go open a pull request and just say, here's my EIP, I would like to propose it for this hard fork. And one thing to note about all of these statuses is they're all only applied to a specific fork, right? Like, so right now we just shipped the Petra hard fork. We're working on Fusaka. We're gonna start planning Glamsterdam soon. So people can go and propose something for Glamsterdam, but it doesn't mean that it's proposed forever. It's really within the context of that fork. And so for the proposed for inclusion status, basically the only thing that you need is an EIP that's been merged and that has a number. So there's very low bar there. And obviously we want to keep this open and we want to allow the community to participate there. Then when we have this entire list of proposed EIPs for inclusion, we want to get a sort of short list for core devs, which is what are the EIPs we think might go into this fork? And the way that we've developed these forks historically is with what we call these devnets. So devnets are effectively just a private Ethereum network that's run to test some new EIPs. And we just spin it up and then shut it down when we find bugs over and over. And so every fork, we usually run through like about 10 of these devnets. And so we have this next step in the process, which is called considered for inclusion. And this is the list of EIPs we think could go onto Ethereum, and that will probably be implementing in devnet. And so when we get to that stage, core devs should generally like the overall concept and idea of the EIP, but there might still be some design or implementation issues to figure out. And this is where we expect there to be more testing support provided. And we start actually looking into like, what's the testing coverage we need, what kind of implementations we need and whatnot. And then after that, sequentially, the other status in the EIP can go is scheduled for inclusion. And the scheduled for inclusion status means we want to implement this in the very next devnet for this hard fork. And back to my earlier point about having all these different teams working on different EIPs, one thing that's really important is that we sequence the work so that teams know like there's 10 EIPs we might want to do in this hard fork. Here are the next 2 that we're doing in the next 2 weeks, because this way we can test, those 2 EIPs, have everybody working on them, and test all the cross-client interoperability and things like that. And generally, this allows us to prioritize a bit better, where we can say, hey, of these 10 EIPs, these are the 2 that should really make it in. So we're going to schedule those for inclusion first, and we're not going to schedule anything else until we've implemented these two and we're confident that like they broadly work. And so at the scheduled for inclusion stage, this is where we want to have test coverage for these EIPs. We want to have full implementations. And again, this is like the set that we're comfortable putting either in the current or the next devnet. So scheduled for inclusion means we want to implement this in the next devnet for the current hard fork. And this implies that not everything that's in the considered for inclusion list will actually make it into the fork. Generally, the way we schedule these forks is there's a core feature we want to ship. Say for Fusaka, it's PeerDAS. So when PeerDAS is ready, we'll move from devnets to actually deploying it on testnets and whatnot. And so it means we're not going to be adding more new EIPs into the spec. And so the scheduled for inclusion status, again, like represents those devnets. And one nuance that's worth noting there too is we explicitly named it scheduled for inclusion and not included to reflect the fact that even late in the process, it is possible that an EIP gets removed from a hard fork for a whole host of reasons. Obviously, the more you kind of go through this funnel, the less likely it is. But this is something that is really important to convey, that nothing is final until it's actually deployed on the Ethereum mainnet. And so the last stage in our process is just called included. And this only happens when the fork has been activated on mainnet. It's kind of a retroactive looking status saying these EIPs were actually deployed on mainnet in this fork. So that's the entire kind of flow. There's one status that I missed there, which is declined for inclusion. And the idea of decline for inclusion, I kind of touched on earlier, is a way for core devs to say no to an EIP for a specific hard fork. So when we have this list of proposed EIPs, at some point we have a deadline to like make choices of which EIPs we want to CFI and SFI. And so anything that's been proposed but that wasn't CFI'd effectively gets declined for inclusion. And this, again, only applies to the current hard fork. So an EIP being declined for this fork just means it was not the priority now. It doesn't necessarily imply that it's a bad EIP, there's a technical problem. And also, it shouldn't imply that core devs reviewed it or had like a strong opinion. Like it's possible that for a fork, we say that, these three EIPs are so important, we don't want to do anything else. We can decline everything else. And it's important that we don't have a pressure that like core devs need a really good reason for it, because then you can just spam the core devs effectively and require like a really good reason for decline for inclusion, whereas the thing you actually want to do is to work on the most important EIPs. So that's kind of why we have the status there, is like a way to say, for the purposes of this fork, we're not doing this. It doesn't mean people have to stop working on these EIPs. It doesn't mean we're not going to do it in the next fork, but it just means that for this current fork, we're not considering it anymore.
Well, that's thoroughly explained. I believe some people may had questions earlier, like, why so many stages? Why not just have simple consider for inclusion in or out? But you have explained each of these stages, PFI, CFI, and SFI very well. So I'm sure that there is an answer that people may have received by now. I'm curious a little bit more about two stages here, because you mentioned that these two include devnets. I'm talking about consider for inclusion and scheduled for inclusion. What would you say is the key difference between these two stages?
Considered means we want to do this if we have the time and bandwidth. Scheduled should mean we are implementing this in the next devnet, and it's by default going to go to mainnet. So you can think of it as just like a pipeline, right? Like where anyone can propose things, and then there's a subset that we consider more seriously. Of that subset, there's a smaller subset that we decide to implement and test thoroughly and schedule. And then ideally 100% of those make it in, but that's not always the case. So when the fork actually activates, we go back and we say these ones included or deployed on mainnet. So it's really just like a refinement at each stage with kind of a higher bar and more constraints.
It definitely looks like DevNets factors a lot into these inclusion stages. I'm curious, what happens when an EIP that is added as scheduled for inclusion fails during one of the DevNet testing?
Yeah, it always depends on the specifics in the EIP, but we should be open to removing it. And the way I think about this is there's almost like two types of EIPs. I use the word headliners because like if you imagine a music festival and you have like a headliner that's announced at the music festival, if the headliner has to cancel, you probably reschedule the music festival, right? But if you have a bunch of other support acts, and they cancel, you still have the festival, there's just less people playing. And I kind of think of EIPs in the same way, where which each fork, we typically have a headliner, say for Fusaka, it's Pure Das, for Denkun, it was 4844 and whatnot. And then when that headliner is delayed, we should probably just fix the bug and continue working on it because we've agreed it's the most important thing to deliver. But for all the other EIPs, if there are issues, we should be very willing to just remove it and kind of reconsider having this EIP in the fork. And that's kind of the subtlety there, where like we're not committing 100% to include it. And it's possible as well, like if we find something that's bad enough with a headliner, maybe we should also remove it and ship something else. But in general, we would bias towards making sure the headliner actually gets shipped. Obviously trying our best to get the small EIP shipped, but if the small EIPs become so complex and so burdensome that they delay the main thing, we should consider removing them quite actively.
I think Ethereum devs have been creative enough to think of ways of removing proposals if that is not working as expected. We have actually seen an upgrade in which one proposal was actually taken out. We have St. Petersburg upgrade. So that was kind of removal of a proposal. And we have also seen examples of proposals just coming out of the upgrade list right before the mainnet.
Yeah, and this is actually a really good point that might not be obvious to most listeners, is it's not trivial to remove EIPs from hard forks, and it's also prone to bugs. We've had bugs on the Ethereum mainnet because we've done a poor job of removing EIPs in the past. And so when we get the scheduled for inclusion, like we should consider removing things if they're problematic, but it's not something that we can just like flip a switch and do it, because all the code is in the clients. Oftentimes these EIPs relate to each other. So, and then all the test is kind of built with all these EIPs working together. So when we remove things, we need to make sure that the removal is also bug-free. And that's not a trivial exercise. So that's kind of why we want to get to the scheduled for inclusion stage and have very high confidence that these EIPs are good, that they're already well tested, and that we know what we're going with. Ideally, it's only in like fairly exceptional scenarios that we have to remove something from that.
That's true. Yeah, it is exceptional. And the best part here is people are open to ideas and open to do whatever is needed and required at the time. So that makes us feel way safer here. Very well. Switching gears to the editorial review of it. We understand that anyone can make a pull request to update the Meta EIP, like any author of proposal can make a PR. If it is other than the author of that Meta EIP or the ACDE coordinator, how can an EIP editor verify that a decision has been made by client teams before merging the PR into the Upgrade Meta EIP?
I guess they have to watch the call, but yes, in practice, it's usually me opening these PRs or people, who follow the calls very closely.
Right. Maybe we can try to add an additional mandatory clause there that if you are proposing this as a result of some decision that happened in all core dev meeting, please cite a reference of that. We know
and that's usually what I do when I propose them. I'm not super precise about it, but I'll say in all core devs number 209, we agreed to add EIPs A, B, and C to considered, and I'll at least link the call agenda, and then people can review that. I'll also usually try to get a couple of thumbs up on the PR from core devs before it gets merged, so that it's not just me going and kind of silently making all these changes to the fork.
Well, this question was more for when it is not you. We were just trying
to... I think I would use the same process, right? Like, I tried to reference when a decision was made and then try to get some confirmation from other people than the PR author about the specific decision. And then the editors obviously have to exercise their judgment.
Absolutely. So under this new network upgrade inclusion process, how do you see Meta EIP is getting evolved? Like, will they become more of a roadmap, or do you think it is more as a checklist for an upgrade?
I actually think we should do a much better job of Meta EIPs, and more than partially, this is in large part on me. Historically, we've treated them more as checklists, and I'm the main author. I think I've had like a good sense for every fork of what is the thing we're trying to prioritize. And we discussed this in all core devs, but the Meta EIP doesn't quite reflect that. So one direction I would like us to go towards is to have the Meta EIP be a much more well-reasoned and well-articulated document explaining why are we doing this in this fork? Like, why is Pure Das the priority in Fusaka? Why was, Forward Fork 4 the priority in this other fork? And yeah, I think that would be good for the community so that they can come and see like, okay, this is the fork where we're trying to do, we're trying to scale the amount of blob space, or we're trying to like improve performance to scale the gas limit on the execution layer. And I think like, yeah, having the meta EIPs a bit more verbose, and that would be good. And then even better, I think part of the process improvements that I've proposed is it would be nice for us to first have a high level conversation about what the goal of the upgrade is, independent of specific EIPs, before kind of getting into the weeds. Right now, the way it works is more like there's an entire list of proposed EIPs. And oftentimes as part of that, there's like the most important one and a bunch of small ones, and we kind of do it all at the same time. So I think it would be a bit cleaner if we could say, what's the most important thing we want to do in this fork? Why is this important? Why does it matter to users? What is like the impact, both positive and negative? And say, okay, so if we want to do this, then this is the best EIP for it. That's like our headliner for this fork. This is why we picked it. And then once we have that decision and everyone's on the same page about it, we can figure out like, okay, what are the small features we want to add alongside it? That's something I'd like to see evolve in the process.
I'm sure with your initiatives around process improvement, we are going to see it is going to be way more structured in future. But I have a follow-up on Meta EIPs. You know that after activation, both core and non-core EIPs, even informational ones, are listed as included. Given that EIP1 defines informational EIPs as optional, doesn't including them in Meta EIP contradict their purpose? I'm wondering if you would be open to exclude informational EIP to be added as an required section of the proposal.
Yeah, I see why that's kind of technically correct. I do feel like it's valuable to present to the community what is the high level contents of the forks and why. And we shouldn't expect them to have super deep context around like the minutia of the EIP process. In this specific case, I think we should probably be more willing to revisit our definitions of categories and different types of EIP to like suit the process than to try and have this non-obvious meta EIP that's really hard to understand just because it fits with all of our constraints. This is something I haven't had the time for it, but I do think we should try to rethink a bit more like the EIP process and the different categories of EIPs and how they actually fit with what we ship on mainnet. Because like you said, like, meta EIPs, informational EIPs are kind of being used in a bunch of weird and different ways. And maybe we just need different types of categories to think about this stuff better, or like we should have, consensus critical changes, we should have non-consensus critical changes, or, optional versus not optional, and maybe like EIPs that are more descriptive, like these hard fork metas, and EIPs that are more like about the specific issue. So I lean towards like rethinking the EIP categorization to match the process. And the reason for this is I think the process generally works in that Ethereum ships these upgrades, the software is generally safe and it works. So I feel like we should make the EIP process work for like the actual hard forks we're trying to deliver rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I'm in favor of having the mention of information EIP on the Meta EIP, suggesting that it is there. But I was just curious about keeping it in the required section because, again, informational EIPs cannot be required, only core can be required because without that, the proposal won't work.
Yeah.
So that's general thought process there. I have one more question on the stages here. So all these stages, can we consider these as unidirectional? And if so, what happens when something is declined?
Decline should definitely be final, except in like maybe some small like exceptions. Like the whole point is we want to start talking about it for this fork, and so maybe it could come back, but generally we should expect it to be final. For the other stages, I would kind of see it as a pipeline where you get, from proposed to considered to scheduled to included, and then if you don't make it to the next stage, you just go to declined every time. So that would be my rough model. Like it's just a pipeline. Like you have to go from proposed to considered to scheduled to included, and then yeah, anything that gets trimmed every time goes to declined. Declined is pretty final for this fork, and maybe in some exceptional circumstances you bring something back. Yeah.
Right. So more or less, these are unidirectional, and if it is declined, it is declined. At least for this
Yeah.
upgrade, it is
And
declined.
same, yes, and same also for like CFI and SFI. Like we shouldn't be bringing stuff back and forth. Like we should decide, okay, are we going to consider this for the fork? Yes. Is it going into the next devnet? Yes or no? But then if it's gone in the next devnet, it's like SFI'd. Maybe in some exceptional cases, we could realize like it wasn't quite the right pick and like put it back in CFI or something. But generally, if it makes it to SFI, either it's going to be included or it's going to be declined. It shouldn't like go back one stage. I don't think that specific case has ever happened, but maybe it could.
Right. There was this discussion of like on decline, like when we are saying that when an EIP can be declined for one upgrade, but it may be again proposed for the future upgrade. We have seen it with the EOF, with PEDAS and proposals like that. So there was this proposal of changing the name to Deferred for Inclusion. I'd be curious to hear your thought. Why or why not you think Deferred for Inclusion could have been a better term instead?
I don't think deferred is a good term because it implies it will eventually ship. And I think that's not the default case for most EIPs. Most EIPs just are not going to be added on the Ethereum mainnet. If you look at just the raw numbers, I don't know how many EIPs there are, but there's high hundreds of EIPs that have been written, and there's low dozens at most that have been shipped to mainnet. So most EIPs will be declined. And that's okay from Ethereum's perspective. We shouldn't try to fit every feature forever. And I think it's also good to be clear with the authors and the champions in those EIPs about it. The other thing as well is I don't think all core devs can actually give good commitments or good like directions past one or two hard forks. So even you could imagine the opposite, where it's like, should decline be valid forever, right? Like once we decline it once, why would we want to consider it again? And I think there it's like things change a lot, and the ecosystem evolves, and it's possible that we do bring stuff in that we previously thought was not a priority. And actually in this current fork Pectra, if you look at the EIP that's in Pectra, there's like 2 or 3 EIPs that are quite old there. Most notably, I think the BLS precompiled EIP 2537. This one must have been declined from like 3 or 4 hard forks already. And it was never because people thought BLS was a bad idea, but it was more because they thought it wasn't technically ready. There were just other priorities and stuff like that. So I think, it's a good example of saying we had the CIP many times. It was not a fit in those forks. And it would have been totally fair for people to stop working on it if they're like, people are not going to do this. But every fork we did open the door for it again, and we assessed the situation and the progress made since the last fork and whatnot. And this fork, we ended up shipping it.
Of course, I agree. There are multiple criteria to be considered while we are selecting proposals for an upgrade. So that may not be the best timing for it. There are higher priorities, as you mentioned. We should not give up on good proposal. I always recommend it to all authors that you need to stick around. If the timing is right, the proposal is good, it will be included sooner or later. Very well. I'm just trying to take a step back here and understand about the overall process. In your mind, what metrics do you think should we use to measure the success of this process? How do we say that this has actually improved our network upgrade selection criteria or the process?
That's a good question. I think one thing that's hard with metrics here is the thing that matters a lot is the quality of the decision rather than the quantity. Like it's possible that for some hard fork, doing one EIP is the right decision, and for the other one, doing 10 EIPs is the decision. So I couldn't tell you like the number of SFI EIPs is the right metric. Maybe like off the top of my head, something that I would look at is for every fork, what does the funnel look like? Like how many get proposed versus how many get CFI'd versus scheduled versus included. And it would be healthy if proposed is much bigger than CFI, CFI is bigger than SFI, and SFI is pretty close to included. And I don't have like a rough like percentage or something like that, but if it didn't look like a pipeline like that, it would tell you something is wrong. I think the other thing that I would look at is just like the delay to come to these decisions. So the other part where the process is helpful is instead of arguing over an EIP for 6 months, can we just DFI it and say we'll discuss it in the next fork? So the kind of deadline between the first call for proposals for a hard fork and the final set of EIPs should hopefully get shorter, and that would be a sign that at least the process is working. The thing that would be hard with that, though, is it's so little data points, right? Every fork can be kind of unique, but in like a year or two, once we have more runs at this, you would hope that this kind of shrinks. Yeah, to me, those would be the two, but I think they're kind of less important than whether we actually make the right decision for what goes in. And that's a harder metric to measure. Yeah.
Right. And I believe when we are considering this metrics with respect to network upgrade, it will anyway give us a longer duration because we can see the frequency of an upgrade between 6 to 8 months or 9 months. So we will get to know and realize if the process is effective and maybe next 2 to 3 years with whatever data point we can collect and try to analyze the situation. All right, I think that concluded my list of questions with respect to Proposal 7723 in specific. People on the call, if you have any questions on this particular proposal, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we will invite you to take the question. But Tim, since I have you here today, if it's all right, maybe let's touch on another big topic that you have recently proposed, the proposal to restructure the all core dev process into ACDE, DC, and DT. So what do you say is the specific pain point you are hoping to solve with this restructuring?
There are a lot of pain points I'm hoping to solve, but I think if I had to distill it, it's just better clarity of the different stages, kind of like what we've been discussing. And the reason why this is important is just because there's a lot of different peoples participating in this, and you kind of want to give them clear guidelines of where and how to interact. And so at the high level, the first part of the process is saying we should separate planning the fork from implementing the fork. And we've already kind of done this. So we had these testing calls that have gone on for years now where we get very much into the weeds of like which PR is going into which EIP and what's the status of the devnets and whatnot. And we discussed this a bit on Awkward Devs too, but we do a lot of it on these testing calls. And so the idea is to elevate these testing calls a bit more and say like, this is the main place where we discuss the current hard fork. Once we have a scope, once we have a set of EIPs and we've agreed on like what we want to do, this is where we discuss like the implementation of it. And then this means all core devs, the ACDE and ACDC calls that currently exist, should be more focused on scoping the next hard fork. And then back to what we discussed a bit earlier around the meta EIPs, the idea is that if we create more space in all core devs for this, we can actually have like a higher level conversation around what is the purpose of this fork, why do we want to do it, what's the most important thing, align on that, and then get that sorted in advance while we're implementing the next fork. And another part of this that's quite important is that I think historically we've done too little to bring the broader Ethereum community into all core devs. Obviously, like some people contribute. We've had different teams from the community like push EIPs through, but it's always felt like very much them coming in and fighting this uphill battle to get their thing in. I would much rather move all core devs to a model where we kind of actively solicit their input and we try to figure out like what is the most important thing for the Ethereum community as a whole right now, not just what the core devs think they want to work on for the next 6 months. And again, by having like more space effectively in all core devs, I think we'll be able to do that a bit better. So the high level process separation would be ACDE and ACDC are used to debate like what is the high level goal and kind of scope for the next hard fork. And then ACDT, this testing call, is used to discuss the current implementation details and spec changes for the current fork.
Well, from where I see, I find it like very structured approach. I remember the era of 2019 when the focus was on decoupling the EIP process with the network upgrade process. Now we have a structured network upgrade process in plan, and we are going forward with this planning and implementation decoupling of a particular upgrade. So kind of proceeding forward with right approach here. And I believe we can get into the granular description of all these stages with the individual team. So sounds generally good to me. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on the role of communication within this complex ecosystem, because I feel like, when people are not informed, there are a lot of confusion, and that could be one of the reasons for the delay in decision making that we do here.
Yeah, I agree. We need to do way more in communications. I used to do more of this and just got busy with other stuff. And I think we need more people. So Nixo recently joined our team at the EF, and that's been great with this. But I think we need to do far more. I think we also just need to do a better job of describing how the process works. We've started adding some stuff in the PM repo around this, but again, we're quite far from complete there. My hope is like over the next year, we're able to not only align on the process, but describe it in a way that's like broadly understood by the community. Yeah.
Maybe along the line, if I can pick your brain around the ideas or initiatives such as PEEPanEIP playing a role in the ecosystem.
I think PEEPanEIP is actually very good to like provide deeper dives in a more accessible way to the ecosystem. But I think the thing that we should not delegate like to PEEPanEIP is just basic documentation and like, articulation of the process. I feel like for those things, we want to have like a canonical place, whether it's EIP1, whether it's the PM repo or whatnot, that just lists out how things work. And then PEEPanEIP is great conversations like these where we can go deep into the nuance and subtlety of it. But the average person shouldn't have to watch PEEPanEIP to understand how awkward devs work. But ideally, the people who are like really into this and want to contribute or stuff like that, they have more resources like this one that are available for them, and that kind of help them on board. So yeah, I really see PEEPanEIP as just like an extension of something, but I don't want to use it as like a crutch and just say, oh, because I went and sat down with Pooja to talk about this for an hour, now we don't need to explain how any of this works anywhere else.
Very well said. So we'll keep that in mind. I understand PEEPanEIP is kind of educational resources, as you mentioned, to get deep dive into it, and there are other steps in place which we can make use of. I see a question here in the chat by Justin Florentine. Justin, if you would like to read the question.
Sure. It's just a curiosity, actually, Tim. You made a point earlier talking about we have ACDE, ACDC, and ACDT. How much longer do you think the ACDE versus ACDC distinction remains useful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's actually slightly more useful in a world where we have ACDT handling the current fork. I do think we need a call every week, at least, where everyone's expected to show up from every client team, and we can't like block because we're missing some consensus layer team or some execution layer team. And I think ACDT should be that call where we expect every team to be there to show up and to be able to like address issues that come up. I think if we have a longer term view for ACDE and ACDC, it's actually kind of helpful to have like domain separation, where if we want to talk about reducing slot times as being a core feature of the next hard fork, or delayed execution on the execution layer, then you don't necessarily need every consensus layer dev there to debate the specifics of different ways to do delayed execution, nor do you need EL devs to debate the specifics of the slot time. I do think you need like some overlap as we're kind of specking out the high level goals for the fork. But maybe a way to think about this is you kind of need N participants from all the client teams on ACDT, or like a smaller number of participants from all of the client teams on their layer of the call, and maybe like a subset of each layer on the other calls. Like it's always helpful to have EL devs on ACDC and CL devs on ACDE, because some stuff does kind of go across these boundaries. But we shouldn't expect like most of those teams to attend like the call that's not for their layer. Whereas we should kind of nudge as many people as possible to be, or like teams to have everyone with the required context at like ACDT. I'll also say just having two people, even if we split ACDE and ACDC, yeah, and we merged them and they were the same, I do not want to run the call every week. I think having two people, and we have Mario and Perry for ACDT as well, like that feels super valuable just from like one, a sanity perspective, but two, also like a risk mitigation perspective and a bunch of other reasons. So yeah, maybe like the distinction over time should blur. I think in the short term, it's still useful, but I don't think we want like a single person who runs like the entire series of calls.
Thanks, Tim. I expected some nuance in that answer and you delivered. Appreciate it.
Of course.
I have my last question before we jump into the rapid fire round. Tim, you have been part of Ethereum ecosystem for very long time, and we really value your suggestions. So looking ahead and thinking about Ethereum's roadmap, do you have any advice for non-technical contributors or for us at Ethereum Cat Herders on how we can better help the Ethereum ecosystem grow?
Maybe like my first level advice would be like the non-technical binary is probably wrong. I mean, look, to take you as an example, Pooja, you have all these interviews with literally every EIP author, including Vitalik multiple times. I often joke, like, you might be one of the person who's interviewed Vitalik like the most because he writes so many EIPs. So I think like maybe my number one like meta advice would be like to not think of yourself as non-technical or that being like a major blocker. Like there's always different degrees of technical. Like I have like a computer science degree. I'm not a professional engineer. Like I don't write code for a living. I could not write code in any of the clients, and you would not want like a smart contract that's secured by me. But I'm still able to like reason about the technical implications of some features. And in part, this is just because I'm like interested in them and I spend time trying to understand it. And the more time you spend, the more you're able to understand different parts of the stack. I think that would be maybe my advice is like, you have to find some part of the protocol or the community or whatever that you're interested in, and then try to understand as much of that as possible. And explaining it to other people is a great way to understand it. So to the extent that like Cat Herders leans into that, yeah, it is an extremely valuable resource, like to both the people producing it, because it helps them understand what these things actually do and why they're important, but also to new people coming into the community where, for a lot of people, it's easier to listen to someone talk for an hour on a podcast than to go and open the Python spec. But I don't think you should be like afraid to go and open the Python spec at some point. I'd also say that like the recent like progress in LLMs has been wild for this. Just like I've done this a ton. Like I work mostly on the execution layer. I follow the consensus layer stuff, but I don't review every PR to the specs. And then just being able to copy paste, a file from the spec in ChatGPT and be like, what does this thing do? Or is this thing possible? Like, with the Spectra hard forks, I had a bunch of weird questions about like some consolidation scenarios and like, is this possible? Is that possible? And being able to have like the LLM explain to me like, yes, this is possible because of this line in the spec, or no, this is not possible because of this check, has been really helpful. So yeah, my overall suggestion would be just like find the thing you're interested in, dig deep into that, and don't try to like box yourself as non-technical versus technical. Yeah.
That's a very good piece of advice here, Tim. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the kind words. It's really valuable coming it up from you that the content that we are creating here makes a lot of sense for people. Yeah, I can relate. Like I have a technical background in the sense like I did my technical courses, but not active coding. So it makes sense over there. And I would also like to share this piece of information which was shared by a Lodestar dev. He was originally not from the technical background, meaning he did not do his undergrads in computer science. He was from a different domain, but he is still contributing to Ethereum. He is a part of it. So if it interests you, there is never too late to join the ecosystem.
Yeah, and one good piece of advice I've heard kind of related from this is when you're new to Ethereum, or even to a part of Ethereum, right? Like you're trying to learn something new, there's always going to be some sort of resource you wish would have existed and didn't. So that's a good way to find, like, if you're looking to make a non-technical or like more educational contribution, think of it as what is the thing you would have wished to have to learn when you tried to learn this thing. And because you're probably not the only person with this question, and there's probably a lot of people who are not learning this thing just because this resource doesn't exist. So like writing the kind of explainer that you wish you would have had is a good way to get started.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it in. Well, that kind of conclude most of the question answer. Tim, we have one more round for you, which is called as rapid fire round, where we try to collect your response in one word or one sentences. We'll try to get it done in a minute, but if it is longer, that should not be a problem. Just try to answer what comes to your mind.
Okay.
Your favorite Ethereum upgrade so far?
Fusaka.
The next big thing in Ethereum.
I was going to say Fusaka again. Yeah, I'll say Ethereum scaling.
Most underrated EIP as per you?
I'm blanking on the number, but Justin, you might actually know this one. I think, is it 2124, the handshake for the peering on the execution layer? It's very neat. Yeah, so I think it's 2124. But anyways, there's an EIP that's
the fork ID?
It's
yeah.
214.
Yeah, so it's nice because one, it's useful. Two, it's conceptually simple. But then three, the implementation is slightly more complex than you would think from a first glance, but extremely well like detailed and explained. So I think if you actually wanted like, if I was sending someone like their first EIPs to understand like how EIPs work, it's like a great one because it works really well at different levels of depth. And I've never implemented it, so maybe when you implement it, there's like some neat things there too. But I like why the feature exists, and then that it actually has a bit of quirks in it, but that it's so well explained in the EIP that you feel like you learn a lot.
And the good news for people who may not have known about this proposal, we already have recorded an episode to explain this proposal. The episode number is 30. So please go and check it out. We'll try to add the link here in description. The next one here is hardest all-core dev call you have hosted.
I don't know about the hardest. Like, there's been a lot of hard ones. One that I do remember, one of the first I've hosted was the call where we agreed what we would do with ProgPal and kind of the path forward there. And I remember it was during ECC, and that was still on like Fridays. So it was like Friday night in France for me. So I remember that one being particularly hard, but also kind of nice because we did come to a resolution and then wrapping up my week in Paris after ECC. So it's kind of a nice contrast of like relatively hard call, but then we got to a conclusion and it was the weekend in Paris.
ProgPow was altogether a different subject.
Yeah.
Very well. My next question is your favorite word as on date. It could be a feature, it could be an upgrade, or anything related to maybe crypto Twitter.
I feel like the thing I use the most frequently is the smiling and sweating emoji. So that would be it.
Right.
Yes.
What is the biggest governance pain point?
I think fundamentally it's like an unsolvable problem. And so you kind of have, there's no clean solution. So you kind of have to just muddle around. There's a good book about this. I think it's called like Slouching Towards Utopia. And the idea is there's a lot of people, they come up with these very like top-down fancy governance frameworks. And this is for the real world, it's not for crypto. And they often result in just like tyrannies because like the real world is much more messy. And a lot of the like better outcomes we see in the world are just this like very iterative, like complex, like a bit unsatisfying process, but it just at each step kind of tries to do a bit better. So that's like, I think the fundamental problem is like you have to like slouch towards utopia, but it's harder and less motivating and intellectually satisfying than it would be to just design the perfect governance system.
What's more fun, facilitating all-core dev call or documenting a proposal?
Oh, running the calls. Like I really love running the calls. Yeah, like I get really excited from it when like they go well. It's like one of the best feelings. I think it's extremely stimulating. So yeah, running the calls over pretty much anything in my schedule is the most fun thing by a lot.
If it has to be a word, what would that word be that you wish more people use in these Ethereum meetings?
I think the word no. I think I understand why people don't do it as much, but it's very, there's like an asymmetry a lot in all core devs where if you want to push for some things, you're very incentivized to say like, yes, 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 and let's do this. And then if you say no, you're kind of the bad person. And it's oftentimes like when somebody voices an objection, my intuition is like many, many more people feel that same thing. And so having more people willing to like shoulder that burden would be good. It would also make it less demanding on like the people who currently do. It's a very hard thing to do, and I don't know that you can like actually train people to do it or get them to do it. Like sometimes I joke about this with people. It's like, can you tell people to care more? Like you can tell them the words, right? Like you could say care more, but you can't quite like get them to care more, right? There's like a sense of just either people tend to have this or not. So that would be it. It's like if people are more willing to step up and say like, actually, we think this is bad for these reasons, and not to derail the entire process, but to make sure that we don't succumb to just people aggressively pushing stuff because it's in their interest to do so, and then nobody wanting to like argue with them. And the outcome is that we do the thing that everyone silently thinks was a bad idea.
My first instinct was that your answer would be yes, but you very well explained no and why no.
Yeah.
Well, my last question for you here today is Ethereum in 2030, what it would be like.
Very hard to predict. I think I was actually reflecting on this early this year. Ethereum in 2020 was like in this really interesting spot where MEV was starting to be a thing, L2s was starting to be a thing. We started to have a vision for like how the merge would go and whatnot. But none of this was quite sort of set in stone. But I think in 2020, we kind of knew what all the big important things would be. Maybe we didn't realize how important they would be, but they were kind of starting to show. And then that ended up being what we worked on for the past 5 years. I feel like we're in a similar spot today. Like we have a sense around like global adoption. We have a sense around what cryptography is going to be possible. We have a sense around like these kind of end games in terms of MEV, in terms of staking economics. We don't quite have like a fully fleshed out vision yet. And so my sense is all of these kind of complicated, rapidly moving topics that are not the main thing we discussed today, but kind of in the background of all of the conversations will be the things that like we end up spending the next 5 years on.
Very well done, Tim. You answered all the question and you really spoke your mind. So thank you so much for answering all these questions.
Of course, this was great. Very good questions.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us and helping clarify the network upgrade inclusion stages through EIP-7723, as well as sharing insights on the all core dev process. These conversations are so important as Ethereum keeps growing and changing, and we hope this helps the community stay informed, get involved, and contribute to better decision making. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dear listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share. You can find the EIP and discussion thread in the links show note below. Until next time, keep building, keep reviewing, and keep perfecting the Ethereum ecosystem. Cheers.